Hey guys, I'm back with the Creality Ender 7 and we're going to be doing a CRtouch install on this machine. Now if you haven't heard of the CRtouch, it's basically a BLtouch module but the Creality version. There's a few small differences about it. One of them is that it has a metallic probe, which is nice. And I believe, depending on how you want to look at it, normally closed or normally open position. So if the module fails, the probe doesn't just fall down and potentially contact your print. There's a spring in there, like I said, in the normally open or normally closed position, which returns the probe always to the top. So it doesn't just fall down in case the probe fails, which is nice. And I went with this instead of the BLtouch because it's a Creality product. And I figured we're installing it onto a Creality machine, so it should be more or less plug and play, which it almost is. The Ender 7 is a little bit special. We'll get to that in a minute. You'll also notice that I got some colors going on inside of my printer. There's an LED ring in there that I installed. And as a bonus to the CRtouch install, we're gonna be installing an LED ring on the Ender 7 because of the shroud up at the top. Sometimes it's a little hard to see inside of there, and so a little bit of extra light helps. And since we're taking apart a lot of the machine to fish wires through, it's a good time to do that installation. Now, before we get started, I want to thank Mech Solutions, that's mechestore.com, for providing me with this printer so that I could just kind of go nuts and modify it. Check them out. I'll put a link in the video description down below. Otherwise, let's get started. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to check to see what's included inside of the CRtouch box. And so the first thing you see is an instruction manual, and then once you open up the box, there is the CRtouch module itself packed in there nicely, along with a bunch of brackets. You'll also find some wiring, and those brackets there are for various Creality models. Unfortunately, as you'll see in the instruction manual, none of those models are the Ender 7. But don't worry, I got you guys covered. I'll be posting a link in the video description to the 3D model that you can print to mount this to the Ender 7, and we'll get to that in a minute. But otherwise, just a few other small accessories, screws, zip ties, and that sort of thing. Everything else you're gonna need to install this onto your Ender 7. Now you can head over to your printer, look behind the print head, and we're gonna be taking off the fan enclosure. So there's two M3 socket head cap screws at the back of the print head. At the top, very easily accessible. You're gonna unscrew those, and then that entire cover or shroud will snap right off. You're gonna pull it away from the print head, and it'll just swivel down and hang off of the fan wires. We're gonna be installing the CRtouch module right onto the X carriage bracket. And as far as I can see at this point in time, I can't find any other bracket anywhere online. So I went ahead and designed my own. You'll see the red bracket there. That's the one you're gonna need to 3D print. There'll be a link down in the video description below where you can download this file for yourself. I printed my bracket with carbon fiber PETG, and I printed it with the Ender 7. And the two holes on the bottom will need to be tapped for an M3 thread because we're gonna be using M3x8 socket head cap screws to secure the CRtouch module to this bracket. And you're gonna do that by slipping those socket head cap screws in through the bottom of the CRtouch module and then threading them into the bottom of the bracket. And when that's done, this is what it should look like. The connector on the top should be accessible so that you could plug the wiring harness in. Then you're gonna take two more M3x8 socket head cap screws and just pop them into the back of the bracket. There are some counterbore holes for the socket heads to sit inside of. Now to get your CRtouch module onto the X carriage bracket, there are two holes that go through that bracket that are already tapped for M3 threads from Creality. And I've obviously designed the bracket so that the spacing lines up. You're gonna slip the bracket in there and you're gonna tighten those two M3 socket head cap screws down. Now you can plug in the wiring harness that came with your CRtouch kit, and I've routed that through the back and then through that little window there of the X carriage bracket. With the CRtouch module mounted, we have to remove the shroud off the top of the printer next. There are 4 button head cap screws on the front and 4 on the back. You'll see them at the bottom of that plate that runs on the top of the machine. You're gonna completely remove those, and then what's holding it onto the sides are plastic clips. So part of the shroud, there's little tabs that hook underneath of that main plate. You're going to have to pry away at them pretty aggressively with a flathead screwdriver. Try not to break the shroud, but you're definitely going to struggle with it a little bit. It's stuck on there pretty good. So there's clips on both sides. Remember to release them both before pulling up on the shroud. And before you can completely remove the shroud, you're gonna have to get your fingers underneath and start unplugging the wiring harness that runs from the hot end to this breakout board at the back of the machine. And with the wiring harness completely unplugged, then you can head over into your Bowden tube and just remove that. So the circlip comes off, push down on the fitting and pull up on the Bowden tube, and now you can completely release the top shroud. Now we can get a better look at the breakout board at the top of the printer, and you'll see there is a connector there for BLtouch. Unfortunately, that connector is a different size than the one that comes in the kit from Creality. So I would have expected that a Creality CRtouch module would plug directly into a Creality printer, but that does not appear to be the case. Later in the video, we're going to be accessing the control board at the bottom of the printer, and curiously, one other thing that I noticed at that point was the wires coming from this connector here that trace their way back through that large 30-pin connector at the back of the printer down to the underside where all the electronics are enclosed. That connection is labeled PWM, and there's actually only 2 of those pins that run down into the electronic enclosure below, and they connect to the connector on the main board called in and out. And so there's only 2 of the 5 that are running. So I'm wondering if maybe 3 of these pins are redundant up at the top, like let's say a ground, the 5-volt source, and that sort of thing. So they really only need to run 2 down there. So I suppose it's possible that if you had the correct size connector, you could plug directly into here, and that would save you a lot of time and effort running the connector all the way down through and into the bottom of the printer. But in this case, I don't have the proper connector, so I'm going to be going the long route, and I'm going to be routing this all the way down the back of the printer, through the grommet at the back, and then into the electronics enclosure. And since we're talking about cable routing, you're going to be reusing these cable retaining clips from Creality. Get a flathead screwdriver under them, pry up on them, and release them. We're going to be reusing them later. Now we have to get the CRtouch wiring harness to the back of the printer, and I was not able to fish it through the original wire sheathing. There just wasn't enough room, so I got some larger stuff here and replaced it. This is also a good time to get started on any other wiring modifications that you want to do to this printer, and in my case, I want to add an LED ring to the inside of the top cover here, and so I'm going to be putting in an RGB LED controller and wiring that down through the back as well. Now you can go get the top shroud of the machine and pull all of the hot end wires through it, remaking all of your connections on the breakout board. I added a small zip tie on the underside here to make sure that that wiring harness is less likely to pull through the top and accidentally undo any of those connections at the back. I would also recommend that once those connections are made, you put some hot glue on them like they came from the factory, and then you can route everything down along the back of the printer, and we're going to be pushing everything through that rubber grommet at the bottom of the printer into the electronics enclosure. On the printhead, you're also going to want to start tidying up your wiring. I've added a zip tie there to secure everything into place and to sort of squish down the new wire sheathing so that it fits through the hole on the Creality Ender 7 shroud cover. And you'll see here that it should push over top, and we're going to be resecuring that with the 2 M3 socket head cap screws at the back of the shroud. Now you can take the large connector and plug it back into the back of the printer, and you can also take your M3 button head cap screws that secure the top shroud down and put all those back in because we're done with the top shroud. At this point, you can also put the Creality cable retaining clips back into place, and the additional wires that you ran should be able to fit underneath of them. Turn your printer onto its side, and I would suggest leaning it onto the side opposite of the Bowden extruder because that extruder sticks out and you don't want to damage it. Then you're going to remove all of the small M3 button head cap screws that secure the bottom plate of the printer onto the frame. With all those screws removed, the panel just simply comes off and it exposes the electronics underneath. And according to the instruction manual that came with the printer, the AutoBed Leveling connector is located right here on the main board. And in the instruction manual, you can even read the little pin descriptions, and that's going to tell you what each pin is responsible for. Now looking at the actual main board, this is the connector right here. And you'll see me lightly tugging away at the connector. It's not coming off. You'll probably have to pick away at a little bit of hot glue that they installed at the factory before you can easily remove that connector. You'll also notice that this connector only has 2 wires populated in there, and the label says PWM. This goes back up to the breakout board at the top of the printer, and I discussed that earlier in the video and my speculation as to what was going on there. Now what you're looking at is the CRtouch wiring harness plugged into the Creality mainboard, and from top to bottom you can see the wire colors: white, black, yellow, red, blue, and that's the order that they're going in. What's harder to tell is that that's not the plug that came with the CRtouch harness. So what I did was I depinned the plug that came with the CRtouch harness. I removed the plug from the mainboard that used to have the 2 wires going into there that was labeled PWM. I depinned that. The wire terminals that come with the CRtouch wiring harness, they will plug into the original Creality 5-pin connector. And so just orient the pins in this order here and use the original connector that came with the Creality mainboard. Unfortunately, the connector that comes with the CRtouch harness has a locking tab on it, and on the Ender 7, the mainboard here just uses regular JST connectors. It does not use the locking style JST connectors, and so like I said, you can just steal the connector right off of this board and repin it. You'll also notice that I had to splice and extend the CRtouch wiring harness with some other wires, and that's because it's not long enough to reach this location in the enclosure underneath the printer. So it's a little bit of wiring work here, but it's worth it in the end. Now we can tackle the firmware, and you're going to head over to creality.com/download, and if you scroll down you can find something that says Ender series, and then you'll find Ender 7 3D printer, and you'll see a file here for Ender 7 BLtouch firmware, and that's going to work for the CRtouch as well. And in that zip file you're going to find 2 files. One is a DWIN folder, and that is the firmware for the touchscreen, and you're going to copy that over into a freshly formatted SD card. So it's the only thing on that SD card. And with the printer powered off, you're going to insert the SD card into the SD card slot in the back of the touchscreen. Turn the printer on and you'll see a blue screen with some white text come up, and it's going to tell you that the firmware flashing is done. It only takes a couple seconds, and you successfully flashed the firmware onto the touchscreen. Just be careful when powering the printer on with the bottom cover off. There are live wires in the back, and you don't want to be touching anything back there if you're uncomfortable working around live electricity. If you guys are enjoying this video and found it useful up until this point, I would ask that you consider subscribing to my channel, because I've got a lot more content like this coming up in the future, and you guys are not going to want to miss it, especially with this Ender 7 if you have an Ender 7 printer. I have big plans for it. Now you can remove the SD card from your touchscreen, plug it back into your computer, reformat it so there's nothing on that SD card again, and we're going to be copying the mainboard firmware onto that SD card. So that's the other file that's in the zip file that we downloaded from the Creality website, and you'll see a bin file. So put that bin file onto the SD card, make sure it's the only thing on that SD card, and then we can insert that SD card into the mainboard SD card slot, power on the printer again, and the firmware will be quickly flashed onto the mainboard as well. On the Creality website, next to the download link for the firmware, you'll also find a BLtouch CRtouch manual specifically for the Ender 7. Now I found this manual after doing the design work for my own bracket, and pretty much towards the end of filming this entire video. And what I found amusing was that somebody from Creality had already designed a mount for a BLtouch or CRtouch module for the Ender 7, and you can see it there in green. However, when I first started this project and I was looking around online for existing mounts, I couldn't find anything. So it doesn't appear to even be available from Creality for purchase or for download. So again, if you guys are looking for the file that I designed, check the video description down below where I'll put a link so that you can download the one that I designed, which is intended for 3D printing. And this manual takes you through a similar process to this video, and so you guys can always reference that manual as well. Before we button the bottom of the printer back up, I just want to show you guys the wire that I also ran here for my RGB LED strip, and that's going to a 5-volt regulator. The other end of the 5-volt regulator is grabbing power from the 24-volt power supply. So if you guys are planning to also do any sort of RGB LED light strips or just regular white LED light strips, check the voltage requirements for those light strips, because you don't want to power them from 24 volts if they're 5-volt or 12-volt strips. You can now get your printer back upright and head into the printer info to confirm that the firmware flashing was successful. And when you turn your printer on, take a look at the CRtouch module and watch it cycle as you turn the printer on, and you'll know that it was wired properly. From here, we're going to relevel the print bed and set up the CRtouch module. And so you can first home your printer, and that's going to home the X, Y, and Z axis inside of the auxiliary leveling feature. And what you'll notice is that the printer will now use the CRtouch module to home the Z-axis. So you can remove the bumper that I've circled there in red at the back of the printer because it's no longer going to be using the Z limit switch. If you've never set up a Creality machine with a BLtouch or CRtouch module, stick with me because I find that it is not the most intuitive thing on these Creality machines. The instruction manual takes you through a slightly different process than what I'm taking you through, but I will explain myself as I go along. And so the mount that I designed for the CRtouch module should extend the probe roughly 3 millimeters below the nozzle when it's in its extended position. The instruction manual recommends that after this initial homing process that you immediately go into leveling the four corners of the bed and bringing the print bed up towards the nozzle, the thickness of a piece of paper away from the nozzle using the bed leveling screws. My issue with doing this first is that you would be using the travel in your bed leveling screws to take up that offset distance between the probe and the nozzle. And so if you don't have a whole lot of travel in your bed leveling screws, you're again going to be wasting all of that in extending the print bed up to the nozzle, a thickness of a piece of paper away. And then when it comes time to leveling all four corners of your bed, you're going to run out of travel in your bed leveling screws. And since you've probably already owned this printer for a while and have leveled the bed in the past, and presumably you haven't messed with those bed leveling screws during this upgrade, you can go back into this leveling mode screen and you can play with the offsets right away. What this is going to do is this is going to take up the offset between the nozzle and the print bed right now. So by pressing up, you'll move the print bed up towards the nozzle, and by pressing down, you'll move it away from the nozzle. So with the offset in mind, which is about 3 millimeters, you're likely going to have to push the print bed up towards the nozzle until you get to the point where it is a piece of paper's thickness away from the nozzle. After making those offset adjustments, you can hit the home button, and that's going to rehome the entire printer X, Y, and Z, and it's going to lock in that offset that you just established. Rather than wasting the travel in the bed leveling screws, you've used the extra travel in the printer itself to take up that offset and establish a new Z0. With the new offset and Z0 dialed in, you can go back into the auxiliary leveling and now level the four corners of the bed manually. Now that you have a reasonably level print surface to work with, you're going to press that measuring button, which is going to initiate the CRtouch AutoBed leveling procedure. The probe will measure a total of 25 points across the print bed, and this takes a few minutes, so be patient. When it's finished in the leveling mode screen, what you'll notice is that all of those numbers that used to be all zeros are now populated with values that correlate to those 25 points that it measured. And finally, with all of that complete, you're ready for your first print using the AutoBed leveling feature on the Ender 7. Now, I did not modify my Start G code so that at the beginning of every print, it goes through the AutoBed leveling procedure because those 25 points take quite some time. If you have time on your hands and that's something that you want to do, then in your Start G code, I believe you can add the G29 command, which is going to initiate that AutoBed leveling feature at the beginning of every single print. One final thing worth mentioning here is that most people would recommend that you run your AutoBed leveling with the print bed preheated, and I would recommend the same thing. I didn't do it in this first case and I had to go back and redo it again. And the reason for this is that as things heat up, parts tend to expand with heat. And so you're going to want to get that profile of your print bed with the print bed hot. This is the actual very first print that I've run with the CRtouch module, and it's looking pretty good so far. The first layer is slightly flat in my opinion, and I may have to go back and make a minor adjustment on the Z offset, but otherwise it's working perfect. While this print is running, you can also see where I settled on installing that RGB LED light strip, and the adhesive backing on the light strip sticks well to the metal plate that sits on the top of the printer, so it's just running around that inside face and it's not in the way of any of the components. And so that's it for this installation. Overall, I thought it went very smooth with minimal obstacles to overcome. The first layer was going down great, and I suspect the rest of the print will also go very well. Now you can see that I have the RGB LED strip on right now, and using my controller, I can just sort of cycle through various colors. And that is pretty handy, pretty cool. But one thing I overlooked when I bought this RGB LED light strip is that there's no white. It's not RGBW. And so I rushed my purchase and I bought an LED strip with no white setting, which is really what I wanted, because that's gonna help me obviously see better inside of that enclosure. So if you guys are doing the same modification, make sure that the RGB strip that you have or you buy has white. So I'm gonna have to replace that later on. I would also encourage you guys to go check out the video description down below, where you'll find a link to Mech eStore. So that's mechestore.com. These were the guys that sponsored me with this printer so that I can modify it. And I'm not done with the modifications. I have more videos coming up. The big one that I have coming up next is that I'm going to take the whole Z-axis system and redesign it. So I'm gonna get rid of that cantilevered bed, and that's coming up very soon. So if you haven't subscribed already, consider subscribing down below. I would love to have you guys on board, and I'd love to show you guys the next Ender 7 video. Thanks for watching.